The Rebbe's father's name was Rabbi Schneer. I should give you?
Yes.
L'chaim v'lebracha. L'chaim tevim v'l'shalom. Amen.
Amen.
Tevim v'nigle. Amen. L'chaim v'lebracha. L'chaim v'lebracha. Oh, the Rebbe's father faced in Rabbi Schneer. His name was actually originally Schneer Zalman. But he was a Tzemach Tzedek Sanenikel. His father was Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, whose father was Rabbi Schneer Tzemach Tzedek Sanenikel. He married a girl whose father was also named Schneer Zalman, and they had to add a name because it says in Chassid that you don't marry a girl the father has the same name, so he added the name Baruch. But the Baruch Schneer Zalman Gevarim Baruch Schneer. His name was Baruch Schneer Zalman, the Ravash. He was older from the Rebbe Rashab, I think, by 9 years. But he was a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab's. And he has a reshimis, which he kept of all his trips to Lubavitch. And in those reshimis, you have mention of the Rebbe as a little boy. He describes to the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe, our Rebbe, I think even his bar mitzvah. Yes, Lubavitch, he was a Schneer Tzemach Tzedek Sanenikel. He was the Rebbe's father's father. And he spent a lot of time in Lubavitch. He got married a second time. His wife had passed away. And he married again B'Zivik Sheni in Lubavitch. And he was there by Sheva Barachas. The Rebbe, he was so close. They were cousins. They were first cousins. Or first cousins once removed. His father was the Rebbe Rashab's first cousin. He was older than the Rebbe Rashab, but his father was the Rebbe Rashab's first cousin. They were extremely close when he was in Lubavitch. I could say he in his Rishimis writes an interesting thing. He never really had a job. I mean, I think that's Nigelerent. Kol Yom Echayev. He was the Rebbe Leivik's father. He is what they call the Aniyim B'nei Tevim. Weißt doch, the Lishkas, what do they call it? Lishkas Chashoyim, Shememenim is Fanasem Aniyim B'nei Tevim. The Rebbe Rashab Pashat gave money for his Torah. He was a Yid who spent his whole life serving the Eibishter. He was a Yudel Chitrik describes him in his Rishimis, how they were traveling to Lubavitch. He would sit there, he was always in a good mood. He was a big chassid. And they were sitting on the train, so the Ravash said, "No, we're sitting on the train for many hours, someone should say Chassidus, someone should chazar Chassidus." So who has a maimer, a frisha maimer? So he chazar a maimer. Then he waited a few more minutes, "No, we're sitting on the train, can someone chazar Chassidus?" So he chazar a maimer. This is the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Shalom, Rabbi Schneer. So one of the things he describes in his Rishimis is, he mentions, I'm paraphrasing, this is not verbatim, this is contextual to the Farbrengen more than to the Rishima. He writes that the Rebbe didn't give me a job, but he gave my sons jobs. He doesn't say it in those oisias, but he does say it in those oisias. The Rebbe's father, Rabbi Leivik, and his brother, I think his name was Menachem Mendel, the Rebbe Rashab gave jobs, Rabbanus. He didn't give a job, but you must understand that he was so much better off without the job than they were with the job. In other words, his children had a job, they had a parnasa, yeah, but but he writes those words, that the Rebbe never gave me a job, but he gave my children jobs. The Rebbe's father, Rabbi Leivik, the Rebbe Rashab gave him the Rabbanus of Yekaterinoslav, of the Nepe Petrovsky. So, but he says, the Rebbe's parents got married to Fresh and Ches. That means the Rebbe's parents were married 10 years before he got the job. And for those 10 years, he lived in Nikolaev by his father-in-law, by the Meir Shleima. He sat and learned day and night. The Chassidim of Nikolaev knew that Rabbi Leivik is a different kind of person. And they didn't do a lot of talking, but they did a lot of watching. His hanhoge, how he lived his life. And those were good years, you know. He was living by his shver, by his father-in-law. He was removed from the world. He was involved only in Avodas Hashem and Ruchnias. And then the position of Rabbanus and the Nepe Petrovsky became available. And the Rebbe Rashab got him a job. He got him a job. Today we call it the shlichus. Then I never called the shlichus then also. But it wasn't a fun job, let me tell you. But he became a Rav. I was just talking to somebody the other day that when Rabbi Leivik had to assume that Rabbanus of Yekaterinoslav, there was a lot of politics. There were so many different factions of Jews, from and not from Chassidim and Misnagdim, and the Rav under the Tsarist government had official legal power. He was recognized by the state. He had authority, had power. So it was a position that wasn't just Avdus, it was also Shroda. There was a certain amount of authority. So everybody wanted the Rav to be from their Kehillah. There was a lot of politics. There was already a Rav there. There was a Litvish Rav, a Mesnagdish Rav, who would eventually leave and leave it a Blavik to the whole Rabbanus and all the Tzaras. But there was a Chassidish Rav. And the Chassidish Rav was a Chassid from Tzemach Tzedek. He's quite famous. His name was Rabbi Kozevnikov. They called him Beravov Yekaterinslav. He passed away in Samachtes. He passed away in 1909. I think so, but it appears that even before there were discussions about Rabbi Levi getting the job, the Rebbe Rashab wanted very much that Rabbi Levi should be Rav in Yekaterinslav. And all the forces that didn't want another Lubavitcher Rav came together. Midian and Moya became good friends to see to it that there should be a Lubavitcher. The Rebbe Rashab put himself into this, that Rabbi Levi should become the Rav. And one of the interesting stories is that the Kehillah tained that he only has smicha from Chassidish Rabbanim. And for a chassid to have smicha from Chassidish Rav doesn't mean anything. You know, it's partisan. If he's going to become a Rav, he has to have a smicha from someone who's not on his team. So he got smicha from a number of famous Litvish Rabbanim. It says, and I think even in a Yom, he got the smicha from a number of Litvish Rabbanim. But one of the Rabbanim who he got smicha was Reb Chaim Brisket, who was the Gadol B'Yisrael. Reb Chaim. So there's a very interesting letter in Igros Kodesh from the Rebbe Rashab, Krach Vov, which was only recently published. They found a bunch of letters from the Rebbe Rashab to the Rebbe's father. The Krach is not exclusive, it's a small little volume. Volume 6 of the Rebbe Rashab's letters is very small. There's not that many letters in it, and not all of them, but quite a few of them are to the Rebbe's father. And one of the letters is that the Rebbe's father, Reb Leivik, had written to the Rebbe Rashab telling him that he needs to go to Brisk to get a smicha from Reb Chaim, and he asked the Rebbe Rashab should write him a hamlatza, should write him a letter of introduction, that Reb Chaim should know who he is. And the Rebbe Rashab's answer is, you can look up the letter precisely, but b'toichnoi, the substance of the letter is that the Rebbe Rashab says, I can't do it without I need a reason. I can't just write to Reb Chaim, do me a favor and give my Talmud smicha. He says, but go, he'll give you the smicha. Mipnei shu yirei shamayim be'emes, the Rebbe Rashab writes. Go, he'll give you the smicha, mipnei shu yirei shamayim be'emes. So the Rebbe's parents moved to Yekaterinslav. The Rebbe was about 7 when they made that move, as Echaptis. It was a big change in their lives, from the beautiful life in Nikolaev to the extremely responsible life in Yekaterinslav, the Rebbe Petrov. When they originally moved in, they got a big apartment. Every one of the boys had their own room. The Rebbe's mother wanted the children to have their own space. And then after the revolution and all the tzaras, they cut their apartment in half. They took away some of their space. It says, geworden ganz nicht Geschmack. It became quite difficult. And the Rebbe's father served as a Rav for 30 years. And during those 30 years, the Rebbe's father was Mesa Nefesh. The Rebbe's father showed a resolve. He showed a ikaron, a principle. I guess in our language we would say, which was consistent with the direction that the Frierdiker Rebbe took in Russia. There's a Yid whose name was Reb Nachum Goldschmidt. Reb Nachum Goldschmidt lived in Yekaterinslav. He didn't come from a Lubavitcher family. His father was a Koiden Evachos, I think. His father was a Shoichet, a big Yeresh Mameh Yid. And Reb Nachum Goldschmidt went to the same Cheder with the Rebbe and the Rebbe's brother. He was younger than the Rebbe. He was closer to the age of the youngest brothers of the Rebbe. And but he knew the Rebbe from childhood. I heard that when he came to see the Rebbe the first time, the Rebbe wanted to embrace him. And he told the Rebbe, I came to the Rebbe like a chassid. And the Rebbe Nebuch sat back down. The Rebbe went to Masharum them and him. They were childhood friends. So Reb Nachum Goldschmidt told his cousin Harav Mordechai Ashkenazi, the Rebbe of Chabad, different stories about Reb Leivik. They were cousins. And one of the stories that he told him was that in the middle 30s, the Achveis Tzadik Gimel, Tzadik Dal, the Rabbi came to Kharkiv. Rabbi, the Rebbe's father, came to Kharkiv. The Chetmimim was in Kharkiv at the time. The Mashgiach of the yeshiva was a chassid by the name of Rabbi Kurnitzer, Rabbi Garfinkel, who's a story unto himself. He was a Tomim. And when Berel Kurnitzer heard that the Rebbe's mechutin is there, that the Frierdiker Rebbe's mechutin is in town, so he asked him to come into the yeshiva and sit with the Talmidim for a little bit. So he came to where they were sitting and he sat down to Vishen the Bachrim. He knew Reb Nachum, sat down next to him. He started speaking to them in Nigla. They didn't know what was flying, so he spoke to them in Kabbalah. That's what he says. He started speaking in Nigla. He was way over their head. He spoke to Mechsidus. Anyway, but after he sat for a while, he said to Nachum, come, let's walk together. He was his Rav. So they walked back to his hotel. They walked into the hotel. The hotel was tiny. It was a closet. There was a bed and a table. There was no room for anything. And Reb Leivik was exhausted. He sat down on the chair. And Reb Nachum said to Reb Leivik, "Was legt sich nicht? Why don't you lay down?" So Reb Leivik said, "Wie can I do leg in the cup? How can I put my head in this pillow? I don't know who slept here before." In other words, the Rebbe's father never slept on a bed that wasn't his. So Reb Nachum said that we talk about the Rebbe. Kodesh Mereh, his father wouldn't lay down on a bed that wasn't his own. Must mean that the Rebbe, when Kodesh Mereh later, he used this as an example. But the Rebbe Leivik said to him, Nachum, the face, you know why I'm here? He says, no, I don't know why you're here. He says, the government of Russia, of the Ukraine, invited all the Rabbanim to a meeting. And they're forcing the Rabbanim to write a letter declaring that there's no Kfiyas Adas, that there's no religious persecution in the Ukraine. And the Rabbanim have a big conundrum. Should they sign or should they not sign? If they sign it, they're going to make it better for you, they're going to make it worse for you. It was a bold-faced lie. I mean, the Achazarias was unbelievable. But if they sign, will it make it a little easier or make it not easier? So as Reb Nachum is sitting in the room, Reb Leivik is talking to himself. And he's weighing the issue back and forth. Should I sign? If I sign, maybe then they'll leave us alone to let us do it. But if I sign, it's a lie. And if I say a lie, the pressure from out of the country, which may improve the matzah for Yidden in Russia, is going to diminish. So I shouldn't sign. But if I don't sign, maybe there'll be more. I say he was weighing, he was talking the issue out. This way, this way, this way, this way, back and forth, and at some point, I think he stood up. And he said, I will not sign. No matter what's going to happen. I'm not going to sign. And he said it with such resolve. So Reb Nachum, when he told over the story, he said, the the principle of the Malta Rebbe's Zanenikot, Rebbe's father, Reb Leivik. I mean, the simple truth of the matter is that the Rebbe's father was given a Rabbanus. And the result of this Rabbanus was a life of complete Mesiras nefesh. He was in line with the Frierdiker Rebbe and this idea that in Russia you have to be Mesiras nefesh v'gachelas hayadas. You have to be Mesiras nefesh to save what you can. You know, there were millions of Jews of Russia, and before the revolution, many of them were frum. After the revolution, many of them, it was very hard for them to be frum. Some kept one mitzvah, some kept two mitzvahs, some kept three mitzvahs. The Mesiras nefesh was unbelievable. And Reb Leivik was a Rav. And he didn't run away from the Marocha like the Frierdiker Rebbe describes it. He was Mesiras nefesh to uphold Yiddishkeit, as much as he possibly could. I want to interrupt to tell you a Maisa. There's a story to the story. How the story came to me is a different story, which I'm not going to tell right now. But the second story I'm going to tell you, okay? I'm sure you've seen the videos of a very, very old man standing by the Rebbe's Farbrengen singing Atem Shalom. You've seen the video, Atem Shalom, and we sang it by the Rebbe more than once or twice. Remember? Yeah, he's Chacham Rafael Chadayatov, yeah? He was a Tzaddik Ayid, he was a Abal Mesiras Nefesh Bizdo. He was a Sfardi, but he was a Lubavitcher. If you were in Russia and you were from, you had no choice. Everybody was close to the Rebbe. So, This story, I thought, in at Yisrael, the Sheikh Chabad gave out 2 stories about mikveh, about women using the mikveh. One story is about Russia, another story is now, how a girl who wasn't frum on a Friday night in Ashkelon, you know where Ashkelon is? Ashkelon is in south of Yisrael, it's right near Gaza. When bombs were falling, went looking for a mikveh. She tells the story, it's very powerful. But the first story that they tell is about Russia. That he had, Chacham Raphael had children. He raised them in his home. They were frum children. They were his kids. They were, in the image of their father. But you couldn't find a Chassidish Bacher. It was very difficult to find a Chassidish Bacher. So the woman who's telling the story, her mother is Chacham Raphael's daughter. So she says that my father, this is a Maimer Amuzge, but it's Negea Le'inyan. She says, my father believed in the power of a Jewish woman. My father believed that a Jewish girl who's given a proper education, if she wants, she can build a Yiddish home even if she has to do it by herself. And she's telling the story about her mother. That when it came time for mother to get married, she couldn't find a Chassidish Bacher. So she met her father, whose name was Gavriel Cohen. I don't know who Gavriel Cohen is. There's a picture, it's Sofia, but he didn't really grow up in a home that was equal to hers at all. He grew up in a Yiddish home. Huh? The false Adim, yo. So she tells the story that her mother met her father, and he was a very sweet boy with good midas, a very honest, young man, but he didn't know anything. So she came home to her father, and she says to her father, how could I marry this boy? He doesn't know anything. So her father says to her, but you know. And it's enough. Du bist boy in a Yiddish shtub. Anyway, they met a few more times, and so she says to her future husband, but there's 3 things that I'm not being mevater on. Shabbos, Kashrus, and Taras HaMishpacha. So he agreed. I don't know if he understood the extent of the sacrifice, but it's basket, okay. Stuff not in the mikveh. Where was the mikveh? It was Chacham Raphael's house. The mikveh was sitting water. Like the Ma'ores says Manashas. Why do they say that Mayim Shuv Matamas HaYadayim? Because they would table in the Ma'ores. They went to the mikveh in caves, unless they had rivers. The water sat in one place. So it was a kosher, a mikveh. But talk about hygiene. It was a gefelach. So she shows her husband where she's going to table. It was terrible. And he says to her, you can't go into that. She says, we agreed to keep Taras HaMishpacha. He says, but I didn't agree to this. So she went to her shviger. She went to his mother. And she complained to her mother-in-law that we got married, we agreed we're going to keep Taras HaMishpacha, and your son does not let him go to the mikveh. So she calls her son, Gavriel. And she reminds him of a story that had happened when he was a teenager in the middle of the Second World War. That one night she calls her son Gavriel. It was a bacher. And he says to her, she was afraid to tell him the truth. She says to him, I have a certain illness. And the doctor said that for my illness, I have to travel in the river. It was at night and it was very dangerous. I want you to accompany me to the river. Okay, they went down to the river. And there's a table. The water was so cold that he was a boy standing on the side of the river. Obviously, his mother was not near him very close. But she starts to scream and Pashat cry from physical pain. It was freezing. And he says, when she was crying, he was crying. Anyway, they were going back from the river, from the lake, from the river. Of course, he says to his mother, I don't understand. What kind of doctor prescribes such kind of medicine? What sort of medicine it does? So his mother said, one day you'll know. One day you'll know. Now goes 10 years later, her daughter-in-law comes to her and says, my husband is not letting me keep mikveh. So she calls him Gavriel and says, remember 10 years ago I told you that the doctors told me I have to tevel? It wasn't a doctor. It was Taras HaMishpacha. And we don't play around with this. For this we're Mesiras nefesh. So when he realized that his mother also kept mikveh, and the daughter who tells the story said, my parents had 6 children in Russia, and they all grew up from and raised from mishpachas, and I attribute it, she says, this woman in Israel speaking in Hebrew, I attribute this to the mikveh, Yenen mikveh, the Mesiras nefesh mikveh that they had, the Mesiras nefesh. Ah? Mishachayim is Schwester. Ja. Der Meise hebt sich an, ich habe mir Fassung mit der Meise weggenommen. Sehr nicht zufrieden, ich habe mir Fassung gewesen, aber ich bin ja zufrieden gewesen. Der Meise mit dem Zorn. Ich habe es genommen von euch. Ich habe ihn gesehen im Store, ich habe gelernt, er Sefer, ich habe ihn gesehen im Store. Shalom Aleichem. He says, how did you recognize me? Your picture's in the book. He said, but I gave him after a picture. I was so young, no one would know who I am.
Und ich dachte, und ich gehe voll. Ich wusste, sehr schnell, ich sehe ihn, und ich habe vor Hand, also, ich habe gerne da, ich habe vor ganz 12 Jahren. Komm ich mir. Kommen Sie zu Gabriel, ich werde dich gebrochen.
Jo, bei Schassene.
Das ist aber jetzt, erst wenn ich testen, ich habe so geheim, noch zu sehen, was ich noch sehr, ich kenne so lange, sie werden. Gehört? Das ist ja. Was stimmt das nicht?
Nu, wird sich jetzt gearbeitet? I told the story, and he didn't like that I told the story, but it's such a credible story. A guy walks in Crown Heights, a Porsche Yid. He was, Reb Hill put it in the Sefer, and I read it, and, my name I don't remember, but a story like that I can't forget. Everybody should see. A mensch. He's a whole beria acheres legam. Mesiras nefesh. Yeah. His story was that he went to the scholar. He went to the school in the Soviet Union, and at the age of 14, he decided that he's keeping Shabbos metanemis. That he's keeping Shabbos metanemis, no chachmas. So if you're going to keep Shabbat, and in Russia you raised your children, but you didn't make them. You educate. You can force your kids. You hoped that they'll take it. So he decided that Shabbos he's going to keep Shabbos. But he had to go to school. So every Shabbos he had another excuse why he can't write. One week he came to school, his face is all wrapped, his tooth hurts. And the teacher, who knew exactly what was going on, says to him, today you're going to write. Today we're having an exam, there's a final, you're going to write. He says to the teacher, I can't write because my tooth hurts. So he said, tooth hurts, took him downstairs to the infirmary, took him over to the dentist, who he now told me was also a Jewish woman, a Bacharian lady. And that teacher says to the dentist, his tooth hurts, pull it out. He says, I don't have a Novocaine, I don't have any anesthetic. He says, I don't care, if his tooth hurts so much that he can't write, pull out his tooth. So the dentist says to the teacher, I know his mother. She's herself a dentist. She can pull his tooth. So so the teacher said to the two of them, if you don't pull his tooth, I'm going to write both of you up as not cooperating with the rules. So she pulled his tooth with no anesthesia. As long as she had Shabbos. No anesthesia, So we ja. In any case, this is the story of Russia. And this is the story of the Rebbe's father's Rabbanus, Reb Leivik. It was a Rabbanus with incredible Mesiras nefesh. And as the Rebbe explained, the Rebbe himself explained, that of all the mitzvahs in the Torah, Reb Leivik made the ikir mitzvahs matzah. The Rebbe spoke about this more than once or twice. That the Rebbe's father was Mesiras nefesh for matzah. It was matzah that did him in. They arrested him, Tess Nissen, right before Pesach, Tess, and apparently was connected to this. He was Mesiras nefesh for matzah. Every year he made sure there's matzah for the Yidden in the Ukraine, kosher and matzah. So the Rebbe once told the whole story that they sent a shipload of wheat, and in Russia they used to bleach all the wheat. So there had to be special wheat that wasn't bleached. And on the way, the wagon with the wheat had a hole, and it rained, and the whole wheat became chametz. So the Leivik asked for more wheat. Don't ask, you're costing the people money. the Rebbe's father went all the way to Kalinin, who was the president of Russia. And he said, I'm asking as a Rav that you should provide it. And he wrote a note, the Kalinin wrote a note, I remember the Rebbe saying it, that the matzah has to be made according to the statutes of Harav Shneir's son, and you have to follow all the instructions of all the mashgichim, and they gave them more wheat. They were furious with him. And Sof Kol Sof they arrested him. Sof Kol Sof they arrested the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Leivik. So the Rebbe said, why did his father choose matzah? Of all the mitzvahs, the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Leivik, kocht the matzah. So the Rebbe said, because in Russia, to expect every year to keep all the mitzvahs was a lot. But l'chol ha'pochas the emunah so sein gant. The matzahs do an emunah. And the Rebbe said, my father wanted that they should have at least michlas v'menus. They should have a bread of emunah. Gute Nacht, junger Mann. Hey la 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 ya da da la 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 ya la 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 hey la 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 ya na na la 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 hey la 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 ya la la ya na 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 to the Jew. Right. It's printed in Zalmagrai's book.
Yeah, the book. Before it was only talked about, but it's now officially in the book.
Somebody told me that Chaim Lieberman told over the story on his deathbed. I'm gonna give us the mice.
Remember that the Rebbe wrote his shikha about his father. He was the Rebbe in Russia. He used that word shikha. When the big Rebbe left, he was the Rebbe in Russia.
He's that Russian, yeah? I want to see it. I close that in yeah, very usual for the Rebbe. Okay, one more niggin today. Ya da 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 la la da 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 la 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 la. Da 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 la ya da 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 la 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 da da. Ya da da ya da da ya da 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 ya la la da. Da da ya da 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 la da. Ya da 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 la ya da 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 la 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 la. Ya da 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 la ya da 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 la 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 da. Ay 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 ya da da la 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 ya da da la 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 ya da da la 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 wa ya da da la 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 ay la 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 ay ya da da la 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 ya da da la 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 ya da da la 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 wa ya da da la 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 ay da na 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 ya da la 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 da la 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 ya da la 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 da la ya la 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 da da ya 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 da la 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 da la 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 ya la 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 da la 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 da la